Good evening. So what you were just hearing was from Handel's Messiah, Why Do the Nations So Furiously Rage Together? And that happened to be bass soloist Jay Balin and the Schiller Institute NYC chorus. And I think that's a very important question to be asking right now, because it is my firm belief that permanent warfare is not the natural state of mankind, even though there are people in the British Empire and evil philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and others who would say that that is the natural state of man. I think the founders of our great constitutional republic would strongly disagree. Otherwise, we could not have a government based on the consent of the governed. What we're going to be discussing tonight is the way that this blowout of the financial system is causing certain actions by those that have a lot of stake in it toward war, not just a bluff of war, but real war, including thermonuclear war. And we'll hear more from Carl Osgood a bit later on the fact that many of you may be concerned about war. I don't know how many Americans think that anyone would be so insane as to suggest that a nuclear war is winnable. But I would say, unfortunately, people like Eisenhower are few and far between. Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, Lyndon LaRouche, Donald Trump, President Kennedy. These are some among, unfortunately, far too few presidents who have warned about the danger of nuclear war and that it is not something that can be survived. I'm sorry, we're having a disruption from my dog, who perhaps also doesn't think there can be a nuclear war, or maybe he would try and start one. But let me just bring you up to date on a few matters. As you know, Presidents Putin and Biden just had a 2-hour meeting. There are certain very hot spots between the United States and Russia, but this is not the only hot situation. One of those is the situation in Ukraine, where, as people may or may not remember, the Obama administration, with the Deputy Secretary of State for Europe, I think that was her title, Victoria Nuland, and she's currently in the State Department now under Biden, handed out Hostess Twinkies and cupcakes to people who were setting police officers on fire, throwing Molotov cocktails, and running what Obama called a peaceful demonstration on the Maidan, which resulted in throwing the elected government out and bringing in people sympathetic to the Nazis and to Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera, who was notorious for the number of Polish people and Jews that were killed in Ukraine, and in very barbaric and horrific manners. And if you doubt that this is the case, I would tell you to just go on and look up the Azov Battalion or type in Bandera, and you can see torchlight vigils with pictures of Stepan Bandera with hundreds of thousands of people marching through the streets. And if you can imagine what it would mean in Germany to have hundreds of thousands of people marching through the streets with pictures of Adolf Hitler, then you have an idea of what the United States is supporting, has been supporting in Ukraine. So already that's quite a problematic situation. That's why the people of Crimea voted to leave Ukraine and return to the Russian Federation. There was no invasion of Russia. This was a democratic vote of well over 90% of the people saying that they wanted no part of this. Similar, that's why the regions in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass and Lugansk region, have declared themselves to be autonomous zones or republics separate from Ukraine. And since then, the Ukrainian army has been shelling and bombing them in spite of the Minsk agreements. None of this is discussed. And Putin has said that it is a red line, that there are 500,000 ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, and that he considers ethnic cleansing, that is coming in and exterminating the Russian population, to be something that Russia would never allow. So you need to know this background to, although you should hopefully know that it's absurd anyway, but I'm going to share with you. So it's been all over the news. Russia preparing to invade Ukraine. Russia has massed, and they say, oh, it's 70,000 troops, then it's 100,000, then it's 175,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. Well, Russia borders Ukraine, and moving troops to the border of Ukraine still means moving troops within Russia, which is Russia's right. It's not like the United States putting nuclear missiles in other countries aimed at Russia's borders. Russia has not put nuclear missiles in Toronto, Canada, or Mexico City. This is not the Cuba missiles crisis, although it is actually more dangerous because I'm afraid of the insanity of some of our leaders and also their drug use habits. So let me just show you what was said here by a brilliant senator from Mississippi, Roger Wicker. He gave an interview to Fox News on this, and he said, military action could mean that we stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and we rain destruction on Russian military capability. It could mean that. It could mean that we participate. It could mean American troops on the ground. We don't rule out first use nuclear action. We don't think it'll happen, but there are certain things in negotiation. If you're going to be tough, you don't take off the table. So think about the implications of this. Some guy in the US Senate is threatening Russia with nuclear action. What gives him the authority to do this? And isn't that a little bit careless with something as serious as nuclear war? What is he talking about? And how might that be heard by the Russian people, who did lose 27 million people in World War II fighting the Nazis? So this is extremely dangerous. Also, there was just on December 3rd a very alarming confrontation over the Black Sea. A Russian flight from Tel Aviv to Moscow was crossing the Black Sea, and a army plane, an army contractor plane, was flying straight for it. So the pilot had to drop in altitude 1,800 meters in a very short time. You can imagine how terrifying that would be. And they came close enough that the crew said they could see the plane. Now, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has said, if avoiding World War III depends on the skill of a single pilot, then we are really not in a very secure situation. That is the situation. Now, there are different reports coming from different people who have obviously their own agendas on what happened in this Biden-Putin summit. But following it, there was a phone call between President Biden and the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, where Zelensky put out a tweet saying the two of them have, quote, discussed possible formats for resolving the conflict in Donbass and touched upon the course of internal reforms in Ukraine. What's being reported is that perhaps the U.S. has pressured Ukraine to recognize some special status of these republics. I hope that that is the case. The thing to know in the background is, in a sense, because of the nature of the impending blowout, and because the British Empire, the Davos set, the billionaires failed to get what they wanted at their COP26 conference, which was that everybody on the planet was supposed to toe the line and agree to get rid of fossil fuels and effectively drop dead. That Russia and China did not even attend in person. In effect, they boycotted. India went, but basically their position was to say, well, we'd really like to get people out of poverty by developing the industry and manufacturing and infrastructure we need to do that. So we'll talk to you about fossil fuels down the road. Why don't you do something about it? And not it wasn't missed on people that the people demanding that everyone starve to death and stop having electricity all flew in there in their multi-billion-dollar jets and boats and so on. So this COP26 has been renamed Flop 26, but given the magnitude of the bubble of derivatives and other speculation, they are desperate to get streams of income to prop themselves up somehow while they consolidate various investments in physical commodities, whether it's farmland in the case of Bill Gates or people's houses in the case of BlackRock, going into this crash. So the danger of war is extreme. And there are some other alarming things in that regard. People probably heard today that unfortunately, the appeal of the US government to be allowed to extradite Julian Assange, to bring him to the United States to stand trial, unfortunately succeeded. So Assange, there's still, I think, one last thing that has to be done or cleared, but he very likely is going to be extradited to the United States, where he could very well die in prison. The charges against him should be dropped. He's a journalist. He's not a traitor, and he exercised extraordinary courage in exposing some of the war crimes committed in places like Iraq, Syria, and other places. And also, as people know, perhaps drawing the ire of anyone, is that he released the emails of Hillary Clinton showing that she stole the election or she stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders. We're not supposed to discuss that, even though Hillary could not deny the veracity of the emails. What we were supposed to discuss is that Russia supposedly hacked the DNC server, even though there's been forensic investigation that determined that that was actually never the case and it didn't happen. But nonetheless, we still hear about it. So you can see this has been poured on thick and heavy. I would also say the story that China is preparing to invade Taiwan is a lie and a fraud. What's happening there is the United States is violating the agreements that were made with Beijing by President Nixon. We apparently do now have military advisors in Taiwan. We are not supposed to be holding independent discussions with Taipei. We are supposed to recognize a one China policy. That's what Biden keeps saying, but other people do differently. And we have just been holding what the Russians are calling the summit of hypocrisy, but Biden has called the summit for democracy in the US yesterday and today. China and Russia were not invited. Ukraine and Taiwan were invited. So you can read that however you like. And as people know, there is great question in the minds of millions what actually happened in the 2020 election. So it's quite something for us to be talking about democracy. And I wrote a press release for the international press going into this about the election requirements in New York. Because as we've discussed on this program many times, requiring an independent candidate to get 45,000 signatures in 6 weeks to get on the ballot is to say that you basically intend that there will be no independent voice. Only establishment candidates can run, which means the citizens have no way of indicating through the electoral process that they want a change in policy or that they don't agree with what's going on. The last thing I'll just say on this war danger situation is that there was a vote in the Senate. I think it was 60 to 37 or 67 to 30, unfortunately, to keep in the NDAA the weapons sale to Saudi Arabia. So we are arming Saudi Arabia, which is committing, as people know, an atrocious blockade and bombing against Yemen, and used to have some of the most hideous conditions in that country on the world, rivaled now only by Afghanistan in terms of the starvation potentially of millions of children and millions of people. So this is not acceptable. And it's urgent that the American people inform themselves of the situation and speak out. We had a revolution against the British Empire, and it was not so we could turn around and become the next British Empire, but because we were committed to a certain principle of freedom for all human beings on the planet, and not that we would impose by force. John Quincy Adams and others were very clear on that, but that we would set an example and demonstrate that it was possible to have a government based on the consent of the governed. And if you look at the state of affairs in the United States right now, you can see why many governments do not exactly trust us. The things that are happening in our country, the 100,000 drug overdose deaths, the fact that suicide is the number 10 cause of death in the country, the fact that 1 out of 10 New York City children in the public school systems is homeless. These are not secrets. That we have the largest number of people incarcerated per capita of any country on the planet, that you can lose your entire automobile in a pothole in any major city in the United States. This is known. So the point is for us to take a sharp look at ourselves and return to what was the American system of Alexander Hamilton and what Lyndon LaRouche uniquely brought to a higher level. And we'll take up later in the discussion what actually the so-called military-industrial complex could be doing, as opposed to what they are being paid to do right now, because we have phenomenally skilled engineers and scientists and machine tool capability to fully modernize the American transportation system, our power grid, our water systems. I'm not saying this will be easy, but it can be done. So with that, I would like to introduce David Shaven, who is a writer and researcher for LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review. He got a hold of the transcripts which were released of the phone conversations between General Michael Flynn and the Russian ambassador to Washington, D.C., Kislyak. And what's in there is extremely important, and I think it sheds some light on the current situation today. So we'll go to him.
The telephone meetings that Flynn had with the Russian ambassador, Kislyak, between December 23rd and January 11th or 12th, I believe. January 12th. There are 4 phone conversations they had, quite significant. The transcripts were never made available until May of 2020. But back in January of 2017, these are the secret recordings. The FBI is recording the Russian ambassador secretly. And they use this to destroy any collaboration between Trump and the Russians, to try to do that, to try to destroy it. What was proposed by Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, to Flynn, well, I should say, Flynn first calls him up because they want a favor from the Russians. There's a vote on the problems at the UN with problems of Israel's housing program, and Israel's going to lose the vote. And so there's a request from the Trump crowd to get Russia to rally people not to vote for that, or if they can't do that, at least delay or postpone the vote. And Kislyak hears the request and accepts it and goes to Russia. He comes back later and says, no, we can't go with that, but we will do you a favor and postpone the vote. So that's really the initiation of it. But Flynn, from these transcripts, it makes very clear at the very, very beginning, on December 23rd, the first phone call, what does Flynn say? Let me not do the quotes. Oh, here's one quote. "We will not achieve stability in the Middle East without working with each other against this radical Islamist crowd, period." And he's adamant, he says, about the common threat that we face. So there's differences. I mean, Flynn was director of national intelligence. He had a history of opposing Obama. He was forced out of the military because he opposed the Obama gang on playing footsie with the Al-Qaeda group, what later became ISIS and the takeover of Iraq and Syria and all the dangers. And in December of 2019, Putin and Erdogan in Turkey, no great friends, but they agreed this Islamic extremism and this terrorism had to go, and that there was a chance for getting peace in Syria at that point. Russia had done a lot to stop ISIS from taking over Syria. On December, so they make that kind of agreement, and this is what later becomes known as the Astana process, from Astana, the city in Kazakhstan, Astana, Kazakhstan. They're planning to set up, I should say one other thing. So right as this is happening, the Russian ambassador to Turkey is murdered, right in public, as a way of trying to blow up this whole deal between Erdogan and Putin. That's December 19th, I believe. This is 3 days later, 4 days later, December 23rd. They're having this conversation about Islamic extremism. Kislyak says, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's just the next meeting, December 29th. Kislyak on December 29th will propose what he wants from the US. I'll just say it. It's three things. The Russian and American experts to begin immediately on coordinating how to go after Islamic extremism and how to stabilize Syria. Number two, Putin and Trump should get on the phone on January 21st, and that for a substantial conversation, and that the United States should have they should have a team of people going to Astana, Kazakhstan. They're invited to this meeting that already Putin has set up between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. So those are the three things, and Flynn likes that. That's what means real serious cooperation. FBI's got this on tape. They're hearing all this stuff. So the intelligence community goes crazy. On December 25th, people remember that Christmas Day. That's when the Russian army chorus, the Alexandrov chorus, died. All 92 members. When the plane crashes, they were going to Syria for a Christmas concert. Nothing is said from the Obama administration about the death of the Russian ambassador in Turkey. Nothing even pro forma. Nothing said about the Alexandrov, about the crash. It's just cold-hearted material. Flynn does send a text to Kislyak. I'm sorry, I'm saying his name wrong. Russian ambassador's Kislyak. And he gets a text from Flynn on the 25th, condolences for what has happened. On the 28th, the Obama team is in action. The intelligence community is in action. That's when they assign an executive order to throw against the, maybe be clear, they sign an executive order to targeting the GRU and the the Russian security service, forgetting the initials, FDP, I think. And on the 29th, the next day, to be effective on the 29th, on the 29th of December, Obama also takes the separate measures under executive order of expelling 35 Russian diplomats and officials, embassy officials, immediately. This is not 2 or 3 weeks. You got to go, period. Forget Christmas. You're out of here. Very in your face. And the Obama team all expect an escalation from Putin. The whole point is to poison the waters, is to blow up the beginnings of coordination between Kislyak and Flynn. If the reading of their conversation is very clear what it's about. It's not a trade-off about sanctions. what happens, there's some technical stuff that happens. It basically involves Flynn is accused of talking sanctions with Kislyak. He never does. The sanctions are the sanctions against the Russian intelligence agencies and police. It's not about what Flynn talks about the whole time is the administration is trying to lock us in by this egregious act on throwing out these 35. He wants you guys to really get freaked out. And Kislyak says there's a lot of people angry in Moscow. And the request is that they do something moderate, reciprocal, nothing beyond what's reciprocal. We understand you have to do something, but just make it reciprocal. Don't let this thing get out of hand. Kislyak understands that. There are much more important fish to fry about stopping terrorism and getting peace. So that's this. They're willing to wait 3 weeks before the Trump people get in there. In fact, Kislyak says, we know that you guys are, people are doing this because they're upset about losing the election and they're trying to deliberately provoke things. Now, the FBI knows all this stuff. The intelligence community knows what the conversation actually is, which nobody else knows about for 4 years. So what they accuse Flynn of, they end up accusing him of is Flynn denies talking about the sanctions, which is true. He does talk about at length, don't respond to the egregiously to the throwing out the ministers. The department, between then and January 5th of 2017, when the intelligence community, Brennan, Comey, that gang, go into Obama's office, and they basically have their meeting, present what they're going to do. They can't screw up the Russian-U.S. peace prospects directly. That didn't work. What happened on December 30th is Putin did, in fact, not only keep moderate, he did not even do a reciprocal action. He said he has the right to throw out U.S. officials. He's not going to do it. He's not going to sink so low as to do this type of sloppy diplomacy, irresponsible diplomacy. That's what he says. And in fact, the American officials in Moscow and their families are welcome to join them at the Kremlin for Christmas and New Year's celebrations. That is what triggers the intelligence community. Something else is going on. They're not going to be able to get away with what they're planning on in a straightforward fashion. So they're going to make this Flynn case that he's carrying out treason. What happens all the time with in the intermediary period before the election and the new administration taking office, the transition team has all these briefings. They have all these actions. It's all well and good. Everybody does it. They're just not supposed to undercut anything or sabotage anything. But it's the Obama people who are deliberately trying to sabotage the Trump administration. Trump got elected on pulling out of these useless wars and talking to the Russians. That's what that was in part of the election. It wasn't a secret. So it's the intelligence community trying to blow that up. So they have the hubris, the gall. The hubris is the chutzpah in Yiddish, sometimes described as the orphan. Excuse me, I blew it. As the kid who murders his parents and pleads in front of the judge for mercy because he's an orphan. That's chutzpah. This is what you've got going on between December 30th and January 5th. In the famous next meeting on January 6th, on January 5th, what happens is the intelligence community presents that they're going to go after Flynn. And they say that everything discussed was sanctions. That's not true. There were sanctions and there were executive order actions by Obama to throw out the Russians officials, the 35 Russian officials. Obama presented them both on December 29th, but they're two different things. And they're two different things in Flynn's mind. They're two different things in Kislyak's mind. The whole Russian government knows that this is an executive order. And as an executive order, it doesn't last any longer than what that executive is in power. And the next executive can do what they want. It's not law. The sanctions are different, so they play upon this whole thing. And in fact, the indictment against Flynn months later, the Department of Justice simply labels the activity of Flynn as being sanctions. They give it a label I forget the actual term they use in their indictment. And even though they don't make any effort to show that the actions against the embassy officials were not sanctions, they just say it, they just give it a title. We're going to refer to it as this. And then throughout the rest of the indictment, they just say sanctions. And because they defined it that way. It's totally illegal, totally flagrant. So the point about it is what the American population hears about what happens. January 6th is when the next day they go to brief Trump on this stuff. And that's when famously they all left the room by arrangement, and Comey's supposed to have a private session, his blackmail session, his J. Edgar Hoover moment, when he reveals to Trump that the Russians have blackmail material on him, and it's about sex and prostitutes in the hotel in Moscow. Trump knows it's not true, but the way it's couched by Comey is, well, all the intelligence agencies talking about this and thinking about this and discussing it, and you should just know what's out there. This is classic J. Edgar Hoover of what we're gonna throw at you if you don't do what we say on critical things. We know you don't like us, but you're gonna have to bow down to us. And that's really the situation between January 6th, when Comey does the blackmail, and when really from then on. I mean, Flynn, quickly what happens after that is, I think that's on a Saturday. On the next Tuesday, CNN reports that Trump got this 2-page summary of a dossier that's circulating on him. They don't go into many details because they can't verify it. That doesn't stop BuzzFeed, who the next day, Wednesday, January 10th, that's when they published the infamous Steele dossier. Kislyak has his last substantive conversation of any short conversation on January 12th. That's it. That's the fourth one. And there, Kislyak is arranging the Astana thing to be right after the inauguration of Trump. That's going to take place. And he asked Flynn about the Astana thing. And Flynn says, yeah, they're sending a team of 4 to 6 people, a team of people to be there at Astana. Never happens. The relationship goes black between this 12th and the 19th of January. By the 19th, Kislyak has left a message on Flynn's tape recorder. They've given up on, there's no Astana. They're still going to have the phone discussion on January 21st. That doesn't happen either. So what's happened during that period, Pence has been sent to go talk to Kislyak, to Flynn. And I don't know the details. It's not known how that conversation went, but Pence now appears, answers questions on Face the Nation on January 15th in between, saying Flynn told him they didn't talk about sanctions. And that's what's used by the Department of Justice and the FBI. Flynn gets officially the NSA in January 22nd. On January 24th, the White House, they go bring in Flynn. The FBI sets up for an informal interview. Flynn never should have done it. An informal interview. They tape record him. They've got the transcripts. They don't tell Flynn they've got the transcripts of the conversations. They ask him pointed questions from the 4 phone conversations. Flynn is honest, but he doesn't remember every little detail. And that's what they use. It's just a process crime, as they put it. It was manufactured. They go into the White House 2 days later on the 26th of January, say, oh, you should know that Flynn lied to us and he lied to Pence. And that becomes over the next couple of weeks, how they force Flynn out. But the whole process, don't think that's not going on today. That's what when these people, they weren't freaked out primarily that Hillary had lost. That freaked them out, the intelligence community. They were freaked out that the Trump administration was proceeding on something simply straightforward and sane. You talk to, even if you consider them your enemy, you talk to your opposition, you find out what the problem is. In this case, you had Islamic terrorism that supposedly was a concern for the United States also. The intelligence community wasn't going to have all their secrets exposed. They weren't going to have their geopolitical enemy operation with Russia and China. They weren't going to have that thing undercut. They weren't going to give it a chance. And Kislyak and Flynn are very clear. We have our differences, but if we can we can identify certain basic things that we both agree have to be done. We start with that, and then we'll see what else comes from that.
Great. Thank you very much for that, David Shaven. So you can see here I have with me Joel DeJean, who's the LaRouche Independent candidate for U.S. Congress in Texas 38th CD. And also Carl Osgood has been able to join us from Executive Intelligence Review. And Joel, since Carl was able to join us, I think I'm going to ask him to go next, if that's all right with you. And then you speak after Carl. Is that okay, Joel?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, it's fine.
Hey, Carl.
Hi,
You're
Diane.
on.
I'm glad I
Hi.
could be here.
Me too.
So I just came from another engagement, so I might be a little bit winded here. But I think you wanted me to address a number of questions. And the
Yes.
first of these is, does anybody really think that do Americans really think that no one would want to launch a nuclear war? Well, I think what we have to hear is actually not so much specifically to that question, but question, which is the whole geopolitics of NATO and the West since the end of the Cold War, which was the fact that, at the end the Cold War came to an end when the Soviet Union collapsed, and so presumably we wouldn't need these military blocs anymore. Well, of course, now but in the middle of that was the question of German reunification, and the Soviets at the time in 1990, led by Mikhail Gorbachev, were very concerned about what NATO would mean for the security of the Soviet Union in the context of the end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, and they made very clear that to the West, to the U.S. and to NATO, that this was a big concern of theirs. So you had James Baker, who was Secretary of State. You had Dietrich Genscher, who was the foreign minister of the Federal Republic of Germany at the time. They both said in different ways that NATO should not move. Well, Baker used a specific formulation: NATO should not move 1 inch to the east. Genscher had basically said that a reunified Germany doesn't need additional troops going to the east. And I don't remember all the details now, but he had a whole formula for that. But Baker had long meetings with both Gorbachev and with the Soviet foreign minister Shevardnadze, where he said that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east, but at the same time, NATO would not disband. The specific reason that Baker gave for that was that if NATO disbanded, American troops would have to leave Europe. So you already had there saying that that NATO had to stay in existence because to keep American troops in Europe. So the intention was never, that was already reflected from the beginning. It was never would you have a situation where American troops would leave Europe. But they made these promises to the Soviets not to expand. NATO would not expand to the east, but they never really had any intention of keeping them. And when Bill Clinton became president in January of 1993, I think already the discussions were beginning that early, or even maybe before he left office, that in fact NATO would expand into the former East Bloc countries. And so they had they also came up with something called the Partnership for Peace, which was a construct that would be acceptable to the Soviets in place of NATO expansion. But again, that was a lie, because they always intended to expand NATO. And so if you look at a map, and unfortunately I don't have one at the ready here for me, but basically you had these several rounds of expansion of NATO getting ever closer to Moscow. You had Poland, Czech Republic, and I forget what the third country was in 1999. This was followed by another round in 2004, which included the Baltic countries. And then you had the Balkan countries of Romania and Bulgaria. I think Bulgaria was the first round, now that I think about it. And then, so you had not only former Warsaw Pact countries joining NATO, but with the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, you then had former Soviet republics joining NATO. This was, so you have NATO expanding right up to Russia's borders. Warsaw Pact went away. So there was no actual military justification for maintaining and expanding NATO. And there were repeated discussions with Russians, first between Yeltsin and Clinton, that the Partnership for Peace was going to be the new structure for the future, but the Russians were never confident that NATO was going to not expand, and they had good reason not to be confident of it. So this has continued right up to the present day, really. The most recent countries to join NATO were North Macedonia, a former Yugoslav republic, and somebody brought up a map. Terrific. This is very good. So you can see, unfortunately, Moscow is not marked on the map, but the fact is NATO is now about 1,000 kilometers closer to Moscow than it was during the Cold War. Now, this means that NATO weaponry can become much closer to Moscow. U.S. Navy guided missile destroyers sail in the Black Sea on a regular basis. They carry Tomahawk missiles, which have the range to reach Moscow. When these same ships are in the Baltic Sea, over by the Baltic states, St. Petersburg, basically Russia's second city, is practically within 100 kilometers. And you've had an expansion of the U.S. military through military activities, particularly over the last 5 years, in Norway, in the Barents Sea north of Norway, in the Baltic Sea. The Black Sea activity has really stepped up with both naval activities and airborne reconnaissance activities. And you've had expansion of military activities in Greece, in Romania, and Bulgaria, and Poland. We now have an Army Corps headquarters, forward headquarters stationed in Poland. This has occurred only in the last 2 years. And it's the U.S. Army 5th Corps. So they would have the command ability to control at least two full divisions of troops, 30 to 40,000 troops, were such a deployment to be decided on. But the capability of controlling that deployment is already there now. And you've had the deployment of fighter jets, drones. You have U.S. in Romania. You have U.S. Marines exercising in Norway. So you have this massive increase in what the Russians referred to as NATO infrastructure, much closer to Moscow than was the case. And the Russians have protested repeatedly over the last 2.5 decades. Their concerns have been ignored. Their legitimate security concerns have been ignored. Now, Vladimir Putin calls these his red lines, or Russia's red lines, particularly in the case of Ukraine, but also Georgia. Now, people will recall that in Ukraine there was a coup, 2014. The coup was actually dominated by neo-Nazi groups that were supported by the U.S. State Department, Victoria Nuland in particular, who bragged that the State Department spent $5 billion to put this coup regime into power in Kiev, which can't stay in power unless it's supported without the support of the neo-Nazi groups. So you have a hostile regime that's put in place in Ukraine, hostile to Russia, very Russophobic. That's what these neo-Nazi groups are. They're Russophobic. So you had a revolt in Crimea and then in the southeast region of the Donbass, because these were mostly Russian-speaking people who did not want to live under the rule of these neo-Nazis. And but if you look at the NATO narrative, this is never mentioned. Crimea was illegally annexed. Russia invaded the Donbass region, invaded Ukraine. These are the narratives that are promoted by NATO. What really happened is never discussed. And so they talk about bringing more support into providing them supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine, even though, of course, we don't respect the territorial integrity of Syria, where U.S. troops are basically invaders. So the hypocrisy is fairly thick here. And so this is escalated especially over the last 6 years since 2014. So the question then becomes, at the same time, actually, what's been happening also over the last 5 years or so is basically a sort of a ghost rewrite of U.S. nuclear doctrine, because the 2010 nuclear posture review that was produced by the Obama administration actually was talking about reducing the reliability, U.S. military reliability on nuclear weapons. So they would come up with other ways of meeting the objectives. The NPR that was produced under Trump actually reversed that trend and actually called for two new types of nuclear weapons: a low-yield warhead, which would be installed on nuclear ballistic missile submarines, and a ship-launched nuclear cruise missile. These were actually mandated by the 2018 NPR under Trump. This was at this point the Pentagon, where most of this doctrine was created, was completely under the control of neocons with the British geopolitical outlook. This happened under General James Mattis when he was Secretary of Defense. And so, and then you have basically, with the increase in tensions and the increase in the potential war danger, you then have the question coming up, well, if there's a conflict between the U.S. and Russia, will it involve nuclear weapons? Well, Russia is a nuclear armed state, and they do depend on their nuclear arsenal as part of their defense doctrine. They do have a no first use doctrine, except in case of existential threat to the state itself. The U.S. has never had a no first use doctrine. The Pentagon, the military, the architects of the nuclear strategy within the Pentagon are opposed to a no first use doctrine. And the question becomes, of course, if there's a conflict, what happens if this does not go well for the U.S. side? Now, this can also be applied to China around the Taiwan question, because the Chinese have built up a very modern force with very modern and accurate weapons, but they have but as in the case of Russia, their concern is defending their legitimate national interests. It's not dominating the world geopolitically, which is the U.S. doctrine, controlled by from London, basically. So the danger then becomes, okay, so now the U.S. is trying to contain two countries, because of its geopolitical doctrine. So that greatly increases the risk that nuclear weapons will be used. In fact, this was indicated by an article that was produced by the commander of U.S. Strategic Command the article was actually produced in September of 2019, but published in 2020. Maybe I'm off by a year. Maybe it was September, produced in January. I think it was early this year, but actually written while Trump was still president. But basically, what Admiral Richard, the commander of Strategic Command, put on the table was the increasing potential that nuclear weapons would be used in the next conflict, as opposed to previous formulations which said that nuclear weapons were unlikely to be used in the next conflict. So already that's an indication of the increased risk. And then you have madmen like Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, who said just this week on Fox TV News that everything should be on the table, that the U.S. Navy should flood the Black Sea with ships, guided missile destroyers. They should bombard Russian forces, and first use of nuclear weapons should be on the table. So this just goes over the top. So that begins to get, I think, at the first question, your first question, Diane. Now, your second question was, what was the significance of Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative? Well, Ronald Reagan had a very deep concern about the danger that nuclear weapons posed, a concern that actually that began with him 20 years before he became president. So even while he was governor of California, he was looking into this question of how do you deal with this danger of nuclear weapons. Now, remember, in the 60s and 70s, each side had more than 10,000 nuclear weapons aimed at each other. And it turned out that Reagan's view of this actually coincided with the view of Lyndon LaRouche, and who had been campaigning for beam weapon defense as early as 1977, after Jimmy Carter became president. And so we have the famous picture, if somebody has it, I hope you can show it, otherwise you've probably seen it before, of Reagan during the New Hampshire primary campaign, Reagan sitting at the dais next to Lyndon LaRouche, and they're conversing. And so But the whole point of the Strategic Defense Initiative was to replace the Kissingerian doctrine of mutual assured destruction, with a policy of assured survival, and as Reagan said, to make nuclear weapons obsolete. Now, and a key part of the proposal of the policy was that the U.S. would share that technology, what the Soviets would call new physical principles, would share that technology with the Soviet Union. Now, there were a number of problems, unfortunately, one of which was, of course, the policy was sabotaged from within the Reagan administration. I think I recall that Baker was one of the people who played a key role in this. And also Gorbachev, the Russians never believed that the U.S. would actually share the technology. Well, Lyndon LaRouche had warned them that if they did not accept the policy, including the sharing of the technology, that the Soviet Union would collapse in about 5 years. Which is, as we all know, it actually took about 6, but it happened exactly the way that LaRouche forecasted it would. But the whole point being is that a missile defense is a policy of assured survival if the objective is to make nuclear weapons obsolete for the benefit of all. Whereas the policy that has been pursued by the U.S., particularly since the George W. Bush administration, has been one of geopolitical superiority, where we walked out of the ABM Treaty in 2002 and started building missile defenses, rigging both Russia and China with missile defenses, which were really there to support offensive operations, not defensive, not straight defense. So that is another aspect of the danger that I was referring to a moment ago. Now, move on to the third question. So how do we know that China is not a threat? Well, first of all, China does not have a history of being attempting to be a geopolitically dominant power. Secondly, is the Belt and Road policy, which is a policy of actually development of, like Lyndon LaRouche's land bridge policy, of developing infrastructure in all the countries that want it. So they just don't have this geopolitical outlook. So I'd certainly be happy to participate further in the discussion, but I think that would certainly get it started.
Great, very good. I did dig up this slide. I'll just show the picture that you were talking about with LaRouche and Reagan, which we've shown.
Yep, there it is.
Oh, it's there. Yep, exactly. Okay. Is that me sharing that, or was that Dave? Oh, well, whoever it was brilliantly done. So now I'd like to hear what Joel has to say, and then I think we should have some discussion of how to get out of this and to what better use we can put all of these giant mega companies that have great talent and potential other than blowing up the planet. So Joel, our candidate for Congress in Texas. And by the way, Carl, I neglected to tell people that you also are a researcher and writer for Executive Intelligence Review, and you've been following Pentagon and military affairs for some time. So that qualifies you to know something about these matters. Joel, go ahead.
What the Russians did not understand is, in the metric system, 1 inch is equal to 1,000 kilometers. So they've come to know that now. But for most of the 1980s, I was a proud member of the military-industrial complex, at least the industrial side. I worked for a large defense contractor in Dallas, designing infrared detection and targeting systems that was paired with a high-powered laser that the pilot or a weapon system officer could, once they had acquired a target, could shine the laser on the target, and the reflection would come back, and a laser-guided bomb with a detector on its nose would simply follow the glide path of the reflected laser signal directly to the target. These systems were designed to stop a Warsaw Pact Soviet Union invasion, a tank invasion of Western Europe, which was a danger in the 1980s. The purpose of these tactical systems was to stop that invasion below the threshold of using tactical nuclear weapons. Now, the first time these weapons were actually used was in 1986, when the U.S. bombed Gaddafi's tent outside Benghazi and killed one of his adopted children. And at that time, I was cheerleading. I was cheering this attack because Gaddafi was then the boogeyman. But 3 years later, the Berlin Wall fell down. And as was said, a couple of years after that, the whole Soviet Empire collapsed. So the Warsaw Pact no longer existed. The Russian armies were withdrawn to the borders of Russia. And NATO at that time, as LaRouche had said, should have been disbanded. But no, not only did we enlarge NATO, we proceeded to use these laser-guided weapons to blow up Iraq in the first Gulf War, to blow up the electric grid, to blow up power plants, to blow up hospitals. And then throughout the 90s, we enlarged NATO. And then we went to war with Serbia. We bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and said, oops, that was a mistake. And then, after 9/11, which was financed, and it's admitted that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, who most of them couldn't speak English. So how did they work and organize in the United States for over a year? Now, after we invaded Afghanistan, Afghanistan didn't provide enough targets for these weapons, so they decided to attack Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein. And then, once the Iraq invasion was over, we decided to go after Libya again, Syria, and the eventual goal was to go after Iran. Now, all of these weapons were designed in the 80s. The division, the company I worked for, the division that was the arms division, was sold to Raytheon in 97 as part of the peace dividend. Now, not only did we attack Iraq, Syria, Libya, but instead of going after Saudi Arabia, we have given them over $100 billion in weapons and training. And Saudi Arabia has been using the missiles that I worked on to bomb school buses, to bomb weddings, to bomb funerals, to bomb schools in Yemen, which has no air force, no defense capability, and is being slaughtered. Close to 360,000 people have already been killed. So this is a disgrace. Now, during the 80s, while I was working on these things, most of my colleagues were big enthusiasts of the space program. Every time there was a space shuttle launch or a space shuttle landing, we would go to the local pub and watch the landing live, if possible. So all of these people who work for these companies, I can assure you, would love to work on something like a revived space program. They would love to work on something like high-speed rail. They're not committed to working on weapon systems to blow up school buses. And they certainly are not committed to provoke a war with Russia and China. Now think about it, we couldn't even beat a ragtag army of 80,000 Talibans in Afghanistan. So the solution is to withdraw from Afghanistan and go after Russia, which has even more nuclear warheads than we do, and to go after China right next door to their mainland by attempting to liberate so-called Taiwan. So most of the people in the defense industries would love to work on something useful and something worthwhile for mankind. And it's a political decision to decide, are we going to go for broke and go for nuclear war? Or are we going to join with Russia, China, India, and others to join the Belt and Road, develop the Eurasian landmass, develop South, Central America, develop Caribbean, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and join a space land bridge or a space bridge to go back to the moon and eventually to Mars. That's what we should be doing. That's what LaRouche called for in his 88 campaign. And that's what we should have done after the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Empire came down. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very provocative. The other thing that I was thinking about, and I think is a very big issue given that we have an ongoing pandemic with this COVID virus, which has killed over 5 million people planet-wide, and something that might restore the trust between the American people and our government is if we were actually to take emergency public health measures such as building modern schools, modernizing our schools with adequate ventilation, with UV lights that are known to kill microbes. I mean, surely if if poverty is not eradicated worldwide, and there was a discussion on the Schiller Institute program last week where one of the doctors said, imagine if this COVID virus had actually originated in some impoverished African country, which was also suffering Ebola and other horrible, much more deadly diseases. What kind of new strains might have been developed right off the bat? And as long as you have impoverished conditions, that is a breeding ground for disease. So if we're concerned about not only doing well and minimizing the number of people affected by this virus, but protecting our children and others in the futures. I mean, think about how many people died in the nursing homes because of an idiotic policy. But what's been done to actually fully modernize these buildings? Because there are things that can be done that make, that kill off things in the air. They have these systems in hospitals and in ICU units and things like that. But instead, what did we do? We gave people large checks to stay home, and we issued trillions and trillions of dollars to BlackRock and speculators. In effect, we bailed out the market, but we didn't do anything to improve the standard of living or create conditions where one would actually take you seriously, that there was a commitment to improving the health of the population by fully upgrading and modernizing our infrastructure, making sure that people have decent housing and heat. There was a huge scandal with NYCHA in New York City because one of the contractors that was paid to improve the venting systems, which vent all the bathrooms and kitchens and things on the top of the buildings, they said at the beginning of the pandemic, it's a public health issue if people have decent ventilation. And none of the vents were replaced. They simply didn't do the work. So I would imagine that these companies that you're talking about, Joel, have the ability to do things like this, and we could do it in short order. And I think this has been a topic that's come up before, but I'd like both of you to say, why do you think that we are not doing this?
Well, one thing I'll point out is, you want to go ahead?
Go ahead, Joel,
What
and
I
then
was going to
Carl
point
can
out
come.
is okay, companies like Lockheed Martin have a large space division. They actually build the probes that go to Jupiter. They built the probe for the United Arab Emirates that is now orbiting Mars. And a lot of them are tied with the launch systems, the Atlas V and Delta IV launch systems. So they have divisions that deal with space. The problem is Trump was stupid enough to go with this space farce. This idea that we're going to take geopolitics into space and we're going to take over the moon because we don't want the Chinese to have it. That was an idiotic policy that Trump promoted and then Biden has accelerated. So the reason why they promote war is not so much for profit, it's because that is the geopolitical policy of the British. And the British still have a stranglehold on the brains of most Americans. And we have to break that stranglehold.
I would say, first of all, that the British are part of, it should be noted that the British are part of the military industrial complex through, most famously, the BAE company, which used to be British Aircraft Corporation, became British Aerospace, now it's simply BAE, and it is everywhere. It's like the third or fourth military contractor for the U.S. military, and they have plants, manufacturing plants in the U.S. to provide hardware to the U.S. military. So that's a direct extension of the British geopolitical outlook. Another example I'd like to point to is Boeing, because see, Boeing from the end of World War II into the 90s had the reputation, well-deserved reputation, of being dedicated to building a first-class product. And in the terms of that Lyndon LaRouche would have used, they understood they understood what the source of profit was, that it was the product. And their product was mainly first-class jet airliners. They revolutionized the airline industry in the 60s and 70s with their 707, then the 727, 737, and 747 airliners. And the engineering environment was such that the engineers basically ran the company, and they were dedicated to producing the best product for their customers, and it worked. But then something happened. In the 1990s, I think Joel referred to this, there was this massive consolidation of the defense industry in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War. As part of this consolidation, technically Boeing bought another company, McDonnell Douglas, except that McDonnell Douglas had a totally different corporate culture. It was dominated by the culture, by cost cutting and the extracting of every profit for the stock, every dollar possible in profit for the stockholders. It was that corporate culture that took hold at Boeing after the merger. This was shown, for example, by the move of the company headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, and the statements by the man who became the CEO of the combined company, Harry Stonecipher, who had been a McDonnell Douglas man, that the purpose of the company was really now to pay dividends to the stockholders. So this basically destroyed the old corporate culture of Boeing, and it resulted in for example, the debacle of the 737 MAX 8 airplane, where they decided to try to overcome engineering problems that they'd created by trying to advance the 737, but by maintaining the same airframe design, which made it unstable, and try to correct for that engineering problem with software. And it didn't work. And some 350 people died in 2 airplane crashes as a result of it. So that's a sign of what happens to both. It is profit driven, but it's not only that, it's also driven by the geopolitics, as Joel was saying. The other thing I wanted which Joel actually reminded me of, which is in terms of the risk, the increasing risk, Putin has said in recent statements just in the last 2 weeks that that one of the Russian red lines, the problem is that NATO is coming into the capability, they haven't deployed it yet, but into the capability of being able to deploy hypersonic missiles in Europe, which could reach Moscow in 5 minutes or less. And that vastly increases the risk. So those are the things that come to my mind at first here.
Yes. Well,
The other thing
obviously.
I'll mention is Raytheon. Remember the last two defense secretaries, Mark Esper for Trump
Mhm.
and Lloyd Austin for Biden, were on the board of directors of Raytheon. And just to give you an idea of the mindset, the Raytheon plant now in North Dallas, where they manufacture the missiles that are bombing Yemen, was the only manufacturing facility in northern Dallas that had electricity during all of the blackout during the freeze that hit Texas back in February. So it gives you a sense of what the priorities are.
Right. Now, Joel, just in keeping with your point, I got a note from Bruce in New Jersey who writes, during my time in the Army, I worked on a Raytheon designed and built SAM system. Working in construction, I ended up working on nuclear power plants. I like that occupation better. So I think you're right. I think the people involved in these things would like to do something for the good of mankind. I mean, after all, if you're producing weapons that can annihilate the human race, there's a good chance that no one will remember the breakthrough that you made. There will be no one to do so. So I think it would be much more fulfilling to do those things that create a legacy of people living better off, being smarter than our current generations, and we shouldn't be so arrogant or such egomaniacs as to think that it's not a desirable thing to create future generations that are smarter than we are. I think we should do that. Now, we should wrap up pretty soon here, so I just wanted to see if there's other thoughts from either of you. Maybe Carl, go ahead, and then Joel.
Okay, well, the other thing that Joel reminded me of was the fact that I have my own sort of connection to the military-industrial complex, since I was in the military in 1980, and when I in the 1980s, and when I got out, left the military, I was looking for work in New Hampshire, and there were several companies, including one that's now owned, I believe, by Raytheon, that I applied with. Fortunately, I ended up joining the labor committee and cutting off that career. My father also worked for Raytheon earlier in the history. I'm sure it was a different company back then at two different times in the 50s and the 70s. But I mean, Eisenhower warned us what it would mean to have the military-industrial complex actually determining policy, and we have that. It's actually combined with the intelligence. Let's call it the intelligence complex. Combined with that, as David Shaven was demonstrating, that's in control of. It's in such control of government policy making that even a president can't challenge it without severe repercussions. So this is what we're up against, and this is what we have to fight with these alternative policies that Lyndon and Helga LaRouche have been showing us for the last 50 plus years.
Good. Joel?
Now, Raytheon was started by Vannevar Bush, the good Bush, who was Roosevelt's science advisor during World War II. So it has a proud history. And another thing I forgot to mention is in 1983, I didn't even know LaRouche then, but I was inspired by Ronald Reagan's March 23rd, 1983 speech calling for the scientific establishment that gave us nuclear weapons to make them impotent and obsolete. And I actually went around the country looking for a position in a company that would work on strategic defense. But most of the companies at the time were more interested in selling off the shelf equipment than in going into this risky research venture they called Star Wars. But after supporting the SDI, I ran into a LaRouche organizer at LAX. And it was after I went to New Hampshire and heard LaRouche speak not on the SDI, but on the Moon Mars mission, the 40 years Moon Mars mission, that inspired me to join his effort full time. So yes, these companies have a tradition. And if you look at the development of the integrated circuit, 60% of the semiconductors in the 60s were sold to the space program. The other 40% went to the military for Minuteman missiles and things like that. But there is a tradition of using advances in the military like lasers, nuclear power, and so on to spin them off into the civilian economy. It'd be much more efficient to directly go into something like a space program so you can get the immediate spin-offs from the advances in technology.
Thank you. And that is what happened with the Apollo mission of NASA. Now, I would just like to say, you've heard from me and Joel DeJean that this is why you need candidates and people like us in the United States Senate and in the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, after that Senator Wicker made those outrageous comments, there seems to have been quite a resounding silence from his colleagues in the Senate, particularly Chuck Schumer, who has supported every sanction on Russia that's ever been introduced. And this really is a very grave crisis. So the point of our campaigns is not about something that's going to happen in January of 2023 if we both manage to win our elections. The point is to provide a certain leadership and rallying point for the citizenry now, because the danger that we face is in the coming hours and weeks. I will say, particularly over the holiday period, people who want to do nasty things count on people to be asleep, or people who want to do good things, as George Washington did when he crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day. And we'll be hearing something about that in my symposium next Friday. But this really is a time not to space out or zone out or drug yourself or whatever out of despair. The point is that the enemies of civilization are acting out of weakness, not out of strength. And therefore, we have to pull ourselves together and deliver a crushing blow, which could be organized by the United States, China, Russia, and India coming together to put this bankrupt financial bubble into official bankruptcy. Or as LaRouche said of Wall Street, he said, you want to bury it so deep that the stench can't come up to the surface, and reorganize the United States to be the productive powerhouse that clearly we have the potential to be, as I said earlier, with an enormous reservoir of talented and dedicated people who actually want to see a future for mankind that is not a nuclear mushroom cloud. So finally, I'll just say that tomorrow afternoon at 2:00, there'll be a program on the LaRouche organization or the Schiller Institute on this question of the danger of nuclear war. I would encourage people to tune in. I would also urge people to sign up at dianesare.com. As you may be aware, and as I've discussed on the show, one of the things that Cuomo did before he left office is to add some regulations to the budget, making it nearly impossible for independent candidates or smaller parties to get onto the ballot. So while they're giving everybody, their brother and their mother, the right to vote, and now non-citizens will be able to vote, apparently, in municipal elections in New York City, which I find to be somewhat outrageous. They figure they can let everybody vote because they can control who gets on the ballot. So as long as you only have one name on the ballot, it doesn't matter how many votes are cast. That's the person who's going to be elected. So I need volunteers. I think we have a good shot at breaking through this, where people are allowed to express their opinion, like the propositions that were on the ballot in New York this past November for allowing people to register and vote at the same time, they were resoundingly defeated, something like 60-40. So there's good reason to believe that we can change this, but we will change it only if we fight. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank you, Carl and Joel, for being with me. And I hope that all of us will be seeing a lot more of each other for many, many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you.